My sister demanded the $15 million estate. My mother slapped me, "Sign it now." The lawyer chuckled and whispered, "Do you realize who owns this?" The room went dead silent. I've spent the last decade of my life looking through a viewfinder, staring at things most people walk right past. As an architectural photographer, my job is to find the beauty in the bones of a building, but more importantly, to find the rot. You'd be surprised how many multi-million-dollar mansions in London are actually held together by hope and expensive wallpaper. I was standing in the middle of a decaying Victorian estate in Kensington, the damp air clinging to my skin, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. The vibration itself felt demanding, sharp, and entirely devoid of warmth. It was my mother, Beatrice. I finished my long exposure shot, the shutter clicking with a clinical finality, before I finally pulled the phone out. There was no greeting. No "Hello Willow, how is the weather in London?" or "Are you eating enough?" Just an email with a subject line that read, "Autumn Feast, Mandatory Attendance." The body of the message was even colder. It outlined the flight details she had already booked for me, Heathrow to San Francisco, and a car service that would meet me at the airport. She didn't ask if I was busy or if I had a life of my own. In Beatrice's world, I was just a stray piece of furniture that belonged in the corner of her perfectly curated life. She needed me there for the optics. The invisible daughter had to be present to complete the family portrait. As I stared at the screen, I thought about structural flaws. My family was a lot like this Kensington mansion. On the outside, we were Napa Valley royalty. We had the history, the vineyard, and the $15 million estate that people would kill for. But inside? The beams were being eaten away by greed and resentment. I hadn't been back in years, not since my father passed away, but I could still feel the weight of that house. It was a place where love was a currency and loyalty was something you traded for a better seat at the dinner table. I looked back at the crumbling Victorian wall in front of me. I realized that the rot in my family hadn't just started, it had been there for generations, hidden behind labels of expensive Cabernet and the golden child status of my sister, Sienna. I knew that going back was a trap. I could feel it in my gut. But I also knew that if I didn't go, Beatrice would find a way to make my life miserable from 5,000 miles away. I hit reply with a single word, confirmed. Then, I packed my gear, feeling like a soldier preparing for a war I had already lost once before. The flight from Heathrow to San Francisco is roughly 11 hours of suspended animation. It's a lot of time to sit with your own thoughts, trapped in a pressurized cabin at 30,000 feet. I sat in business class. Beatrice always paid for the best, not because she cared about my comfort, but because she couldn't stand the idea of a family member of hers sitting in economy. It was a matter of brand management. As the plane hummed over the Atlantic, I closed my eyes and let the memories drift in. I thought about my father. He was a quiet man, a man who found peace in the dirt of our vineyards rather than the marble floors of our house. He used to take me out at dawn, his old Leica camera hanging around his neck, and teach me how to see the light. "The light tells the truth, Willow," he'd whisper. "Everything else is just shadows." After he died, the shadows took over. My sister, Sienna, was 4 years older and a lifetime ahead in my mother's eyes. Sienna was the model, the socialite, the one who married Julian, a man who smelled of cologne and desperation. Together, they were the couple of Napa, while I was the artistic one who moved across the ocean to take pictures of old bricks. The plane touched down at SFO at 6 in the morning. The air was crisp, smelling of salt and jet fuel. The car service was waiting, just as Beatrice promised. The driver was a silent man who didn't offer small talk, which I appreciated. We drove north, crossing the Golden Gate Bridge as the fog rolled in like a heavy curtain. By the time we hit the rolling hills of Napa, the sun was burning through, illuminating the rows of vines that stretched out like green velvet. This land was worth $15 million on paper, but to me, it was just the place where my father's heart had finally stopped beating. I saw the iron gates of the estate, the name Vance etched into the stone. I felt a sudden urge to tell the driver to turn around, to go back to the airport and fly anywhere else. But the gates opened, the gravel crunched under the tires, and the trap snapped shut. I was home. Or at least, I was at the place where I used to live. The main house was a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa that looked like it had been plucked out of Tuscany. As I walked through the front door, the silence was immediate and heavy. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, it was the kind that precedes a landslide. "Willow. You're late," a voice rang out from the grand staircase. It was Sienna. She looked exactly the same, only more expensive. Her hair was a perfect shade of honey blonde, and she was wearing a silk wrap dress that probably cost more than my first car. She descended the stairs like she was on a runway, her heels clicking against the limestone floors. "My flight landed 3 hours ago, Sienna." "Traffic was a mess," I said, dropping my bags. She didn't hug me. She just looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my worn leather jacket and camera bag. "Well, try to look a bit more presentable for dinner tonight. It's a big night. Mother has been stressed." I walked past her, heading toward my father's old study. I needed to breathe in his scent, to find some anchor in this house. But when I opened the door, my heart dropped. The room had been scrubbed clean. The mahogany desk was empty. The shelves that used to hold his precious collection of vintage Leica lenses were bare. "Where is his stuff, Sienna?" I asked, my voice trembling. She appeared in the doorway, checking her reflection in a compact mirror. "Oh, Mother had it all moved to storage. She said it was too painful to look at. Besides, Julian needed the space for his home office. He's doing some very important consulting work now." Julian. The man who had never done a hard day's work in his life. I felt a surge of cold fury. This house was being systematically stripped of my father's soul, replaced by Julian's ego and Beatrice's vanity. I looked at the jewelry Sienna was wearing, a sapphire pendant that had belonged to our grandmother. It was supposed to be a family heirloom, kept in the safe. Now, it was just an accessory for Sienna's lunch dates. "It's like he never lived here," I whispered. "Don't be dramatic, Willow," Sienna snapped, closing her compact with a sharp click. "It's been years. We have to move on. Now, go get changed. The guests will be here in 4 hours, and Mother expects everything to be perfect." I stood in the empty study, the ghost of my father's presence fading into the smell of lemon polish. I realized then that I wasn't just here for a feast. I was here to witness the final erasure of the man who had taught me how to see. But what they didn't realize was that when you spend your life looking for structural rot, you eventually find the one pillar that can bring the whole house down. By 7 o'clock, the estate was glowing with amber lights, and the driveway was clogged with Range Rovers and Teslas. Beatrice had invited 30 of her closest friends, which really meant 30 people she wanted to impress or intimidate. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of practiced laughter. These were the people who measured their worth in vineyard acreage and the vintage of the wine in their glass. I stood by the French doors, a glass of mineral water in my hand, watching the scene like a war correspondent. Beatrice was in her element, draped in emerald silk, holding court at the head of the table. She was laughing at something a local developer said, her eyes scanning the room to make sure every candle was straight and every glass was full. Julian was already on his 3rd glass of wine. He was leaning in too close to a group of men, his voice a pitch too high, talking about emerging markets and leverage. I've seen that look before in my line of work. It's the look of a building whose foundation is shifting. He was sweating despite the air conditioning. He kept glancing at his phone under the table, his fingers twitching. Sienna was the perfect hostess, gliding from guest to guest, her smile as fixed as a porcelain doll's. Every few minutes, she'd shoot me a look that said, "Don't ruin this. Willow, dear. Come tell everyone about your little hobby in London," Beatrice called out, her voice cutting through the chatter. "It's a career, Mother, not a hobby," I said, stepping into the light. Of course," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "Architecture. So stable. Anyway, everyone, we are so glad you could join us. Tonight is about family. About the legacy that my late husband, and his father before him, built on this very soil. There was a murmur of approval. Waiters began serving the first course, a delicate lobster bisque. The wine being poured was our estate's finest Cabernet, a bottle that sold for $400 at retail. I looked at the people around the table. They were eating and drinking the very land I loved, oblivious to the tension radiating from the host chairs. I noticed our family lawyer, Nathaniel, sitting at the far end of the table. He was a man who had known my father for 40 years. He looked out of place in this room of social climbers. He caught my eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He looked tired. He looked like a man who was carrying a very heavy secret. Julian has been doing such wonderful things with the family trust, Beatrice continued, her voice rising. We're looking at expanding. New ventures. It's a very exciting time for the Vance name. Julian forced a laugh and took another gulp of wine. That's right, Beatrice. Unity. That's the key. We all have to pull our weight to keep the legacy alive. Right, Willow? The table went quiet. All eyes turned to me. It felt like a choreographed moment, a scene they had rehearsed before I even landed. I pull my own weight, Julian, I said calmly. I don't recall asking the trust for a single dime in 10 years. The tension was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. Beatrice's smile didn't falter, but her eyes went cold. Let's not talk about money at the dinner table, darling. It's so common. Let's eat. But the common talk was just beginning. I could feel the vultures circling. They didn't want my company, they wanted my consent. The main course, Wagyu beef with a red wine reduction, had barely been served when Sienna signaled the waiters to clear the room of anyone who didn't share the Vance name. The 30 guests were ushered toward the terrace for coffee and brandy, leaving only the inner circle at the long mahogany table. Me, Beatrice, Sienna, Julian, and Nathaniel. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The fake laughter evaporated, replaced by a cold, businesslike intensity. Willow, Sienna started, her voice dropping the hostess act. She reached into a designer handbag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. She slid it across the table toward me. It landed with a heavy thud next to my plate. We need to talk about the future of this estate. I didn't touch the folder. I thought we were here for a feast. Don't be difficult, Beatrice snapped. The market is changing, Willow. Taxes are rising, and the upkeep on this property is nearly $500,000 a year. Julian has found a way to secure our future, but it requires a bit of restructuring. Restructuring, I repeated. That's a very corporate word for a family home. Julian leaned forward, his face flushed. Look, Willow, I've got an opportunity to move our assets into a high-growth investment fund. But to get the leverage we need, we have to use this estate as collateral. We need you to sign that deed of gift. It basically transfers your share of the inheritance to a central holding company that Sienna and I manage. It's for tax purposes, mostly. It keeps everything under one roof. I finally opened the folder. I'm not a lawyer, but I've dealt with enough contracts in the photography world to know when I'm being played. I scanned the pages. This wasn't a tax strategy. This was a total surrender. If I signed this, I would be signing away my rights to the land, the house, and any liquid assets left by my grandfather. Julian's investment firm is in trouble, isn't it? I asked, looking him straight in the eye. This isn't about the family legacy. This is about a $4 million liquidity crisis you've been hiding. The color drained from Julian's face, then rushed back in a deep purple. Sienna gasped. How dare you? Julian is a brilliant businessman. We are trying to save your inheritance. By giving it to him? I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. I've seen the filings, Sienna. I still have friends in the city. Your firm is bleeding cash. You want to use this $15 million estate to bail out your husband's bad bets. Willow, enough. Beatrice slammed her hand on the table, the fine china rattling. You have always been the selfish one. You went off to play artist while your sister stayed here to take care of me. You owe us this. You were going to sign that deed, and you were going to do it now. It's for the good of the family. No, I said. It was the simplest word in the world, and yet it felt like a bomb. I'm not signing anything. The silence that followed my no was absolute. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I saw the muscles in Beatrice's jaw twitch. She stood up slowly, her emerald silk gown shimmering in the candlelight. She didn't look like a mother, she looked like an executioner. Before I could even blink, she leaned across the table. Her palm connected with my cheek with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. The impact snapped my head to the side. My skin burned instantly, a white-hot bloom of pain that radiated through my jaw. I didn't move. I didn't cry out. I stayed exactly where I was, my eyes fixed on the empty space where she had just been sitting. The dining room was open to the terrace, and the 30 guests outside froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes were on us through the glass doors. The invisible daughter had just been publicly branded. You ungrateful little brat, Beatrice hissed, her voice low and trembling with rage. I carried you. I fed you. I gave you a name that means something in this valley. And you would sit there and watch us lose everything because of your petty spite? You have no choice. You will do as you're told, or I will ensure you never work again. I will bury you, Willow. Sienna didn't look shocked. She looked annoyed that I was making a scene. Just sign it, Willow. Don't make this worse than it has to be. Look at what you're doing to Mother. Julian was staring at his wine glass, refusing to meet my eye. He looked pathetic. I felt the sting on my cheek, but inside, I felt something else. A click. It was that moment when you realize the structural rot isn't just in the walls, it's in the people who built them. For 28 years, I had been the scapegoat. I had been the one who didn't fit. I had been the one they could slap around, physically and emotionally, whenever it suited them. But as I sat there, the heat in my face slowly turning into a cold, hard resolve, I remembered something my father told me. The light tells the truth. I turned my head back and looked directly at Beatrice. I didn't flinch. I didn't even rub my face. I just sat there, staring at her with a clinical detachment that seemed to unnerve her more than if I had screamed. Is that all you've got, Mother? I asked quietly. Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, her hand raised for another strike, but then a voice came from the end of the table. A voice that was low, calm, and carried the weight of the law. That's enough, Beatrice, Nathaniel said. He stood up, his chair scraping against the limestone floor with a sound that felt like a final judgment. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking straight at my mother. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, encased in a clear plastic sleeve. I think it's time we discuss the actual owner of this estate, Nathaniel said. Immediately, the entire room fell silent. Even the guests on the terrace pressed their faces toward the glass. The air in the room didn't just feel cold anymore, it felt dead. Nathaniel had been the Vance family lawyer for as long as I could remember. He was a man of quiet dignity, the kind who wore charcoal suits even in the middle of a California heat wave. To my mother and sister, he had always been a tool, a piece of the estate's machinery that they expected to function whenever they pulled a lever. They didn't see him as a person, they saw him as a walking filing cabinet. But as he stood there, his hands resting on that plastic sleeve, he looked different. There was a faint, almost invisible smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the smile of a man who had been holding a winning hand for a long time and was finally ready to lay it on the table. Nathaniel, sit down, Beatrice commanded, her voice still sharp from her outburst. This is a family matter. We'll handle the legal formalities in the morning. Actually, Beatrice, Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through her authority like a razor. This is the legal formality. And it's not a family matter anymore. It's a property matter. Julian wiped the sweat from his forehead. What are you talking about, Nat? The trust is clear. We've all seen the documents. You've seen the documents Beatrice wanted you to see, Nathaniel replied. He walked slowly around the table, stopping behind my chair. He placed a steady hand on my shoulder. It was the first piece of genuine human comfort I had felt since landing in California. Willow, are you all right? I'm fine, I said, my voice steady. Just tell them. Nathaniel nodded. He pulled the paper from the sleeve. 2 years ago, just before your father passed away, and 6 months after your grandfather's health began to fail, a final codicil was added to the Vance family trust. It was signed, witnessed, and notarized in my office. It remained sealed under a non-disclosure agreement until a specific set of conditions were met. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. What conditions? The condition that the estate's financial integrity was threatened by an external debt, Nathaniel said, glancing at Julian. Or the condition that Willow Vance returned to the property after a period of no less than 3 years. Sienna laughed, a high, nervous sound. This is ridiculous. Grandpa loved me. He told me I was the one who would carry on the social legacy of the vineyard. Willow was always gone. He loved your social status, Sienna, Nathaniel said coldly. But he loved the land more. He watched you and Julian spend money like it was water. He watched Beatrice treat this estate like a personal bank account. And he saw Willow, the only one who ever bothered to learn the history of these vines, the only one who actually helped him with the tax audits and the conservation records when she was just a teenager. He laid the paper in the center of the table. As of this moment, the Vance family trust is dissolved. All previous versions are null and void. Beatrice reached for the paper, her hand shaking. She scanned the lines, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray. This can't be, she whispered. He left it all, to her? Not just the land, Beatrice, Nathaniel added. The house, the winery, the corporate accounts, and the $4.5 million in liquid reserves. It is 100% absolute ownership. Willow doesn't just have a share. She owns the air you are currently breathing. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of a vacuum. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it flipped upside down. Sienna grabbed the paper from our mother, her eyes darting across the legalese. This is a fake. You've conspired with her, Nathaniel. You've always liked her better. We'll contest this in court. We'll say he wasn't in his right mind. Contest all you like, Sienna, Nathaniel said calmly. I have the video deposition of your grandfather. I have the psychological evaluation from 3 independent doctors who certified him as crystal clear on the day of the signing. And I have the forensic trail of the $4 million Julian borrowed from the secondary trust accounts over the last 18 months. Julian let out a choked sound, half sob, half gasp. He looked like he was about to be physically ill. I looked at the folder Sienna had tried to make me sign. The deed of gift. I finally understood the desperation. They knew. Or at least, they suspected. They needed me to sign away my rights before I found out I held all the cards. It was a race against the clock, and they had tried to use a slap and a family feast to cross the finish line. You knew, I said, looking at Sienna. You knew Grandpa changed the will. We didn't know, Sienna hissed, her eyes brimming with tears of rage. We knew there were updates. We thought we could fix it. We thought if you signed the deed, it wouldn't matter what the old will said because the property would already be in our holding company. So you tried to steal $15 million from me, I said. It wasn't a question. We were trying to save the name. Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking. Julian made some mistakes. We needed the collateral to bridge the gap. Once the investment fund paid out, we would have put it all back. We were doing it for you too, Willow. Do you want to be the daughter of a bankrupt family? I'd rather be the owner of a bankrupt family than a victim of a wealthy one, I replied. I looked at Nathaniel. What about the deed of gift they just tried to force me to sign? In legal terms? It's called attempted fraud by coercion, Nathaniel said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The fact that they did it in front of 30 witnesses and that your mother physically assaulted you to compel your signature, well, it's a prosecutor's dream. If you choose to press charges, Willow, they aren't just losing the house. They're looking at significant jail time. The room felt smaller. The 30 relatives on the terrace were now staring in, their faces pressed against the glass like fish in an aquarium. The news was already spreading. I could see some of them pulling out their phones, no doubt texting the scandal to the rest of the valley. The Vance royalty was being dismantled in real time. Willow, please, Beatrice said, her voice suddenly soft, manipulative. She reached out toward my hand, but I pulled it back. We're family. We can work this out. I'm your mother. I was stressed. I didn't mean to hit you. It was a moment of weakness. A moment of weakness? I looked at her, seeing the rot for what it truly was. You've been hitting me emotionally for 20 years, Beatrice. This was just the first time you used your hand. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of Wagyu beef that no one was eating. It was a grotesque backdrop for the destruction of a family. I looked at the long mahogany table, the silver cutlery, the crystal glasses, everything I now owned. Where are Dad's Leica cameras? I asked. My voice was low, but it cut through Beatrice's whimpering like a cold wind. The silence that followed was the most honest thing that had happened in this house in a decade. Beatrice looked at the floor. Sienna suddenly found the wallpaper very interesting. Julian just stared at his empty wine glass. Answer me, I said, my voice rising. He had 12 original M-series lenses. He had the 1954 body he used to take photos of me when I was a baby. Where are they? We had to liquidate some of the smaller assets, Julian muttered, his voice barely audible. To cover the interest payments on the bridge loan. We thought you wouldn't notice. You were in London. You sold his memories? I felt a coldness settle in my chest that was far deeper than the pain on my cheek. You sold the only things I ever asked for? The only things that actually mattered? They were just cameras, Willow. Sienna snapped, her old arrogance flickering for a second. They were sitting in a box gathering dust. We needed the money to keep the estate running. You should be thanking us for keeping the lights on. The lights were on because I was secretly paying the property taxes for the last 3 years, I revealed. Sienna's jaw dropped. Beatrice looked up, shocked. Did you think the county just forgot about you? I laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. I saw the notices in the mail during my last visit. I knew you were broke. I paid the taxes through an anonymous LLC because I wanted to keep Dad's land safe. I thought if I gave you enough rope, you'd find a way to fix things. Instead, you used that rope to try and hang me. I stood up. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like the owner of a structure that needed to be gutted. Nathaniel, I said, not taking my eyes off my mother. What happens now? Now, Nathaniel said, as the sole owner and trustee, you have absolute authority over who remains on this property. You have the right to freeze all estate-funded credit lines, corporate accounts, and supplementary cards. You can also begin the process of a formal audit to see exactly how much has been stolen. Good, I said. Do it. All of it. Freeze everything. Right now. Willow, no. Julian cried out. My firm, the margin calls are due at midnight. If you freeze the accounts, I'm ruined. I'll go to prison. Then I suggest you start getting used to the orange jumpsuit, Julian, I said. I looked at Beatrice and Sienna. They were staring at me with a mixture of horror and pure, unadulterated hatred. I realized that they didn't regret what they did. They only regretted that they got caught. You have 24 hours, I said. 24 hours for what? Sienna asked, her voice trembling. To pack your bags and get off my land, I said. All of you. Julian, Sienna, and you too, Mother. You're going to find out exactly what it's like to be invisible in this valley. I turned my back on them and walked toward the French doors. I pushed them open, stepping out onto the terrace. The 30 guests fell back, creating a path for me. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to offer a fake deer. I walked past the Range Rovers, past the glowing amber lights of the villa, and into the dark, quiet rows of the vineyard. I could hear them screaming behind me, a cacophony of greed and desperation, but for the first time in my life, I couldn't hear their voices. All I could hear was the wind in the vines, and the silent approval of the man who had taught me how to see the light. The structural rot was being removed. It was time to start the demolition. The night air in Napa Valley has a specific texture. It is crisp, smelling of damp earth, crushed grapes, and old wood. As I stood on the terrace looking out over the rows of vines, the chaos inside the dining room felt like it was happening on another planet. I could hear the muffled sounds of Beatrice weeping and Julian shouting at Sienna, their voices bouncing off the high, vaulted ceilings of the villa. They sounded like trapped animals realizing the cage was finally locked. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number Nathaniel had given me earlier that evening, just in case things went exactly the way they did. It was a private security firm based in San Francisco, specializing in high-net-worth asset protection. A man with a gruff, professional voice answered on the second ring. I told him my name, the address of the estate, and that I needed 3 guards on the property immediately. I authorized a premium overnight rate, transferring the funds from my personal account. They promised to be at the gates in under 90 minutes. I didn't go back inside. I walked around the perimeter of the house, letting the cold air clear the adrenaline from my system. My cheek still throbbed a dull, rhythmic ache where my mother had struck me, but I welcomed the pain. It was a physical reminder that the bridge back to my old life was burned to ashes. There was no pretending anymore. By the time the headlights of the black security SUV swept up the gravel driveway, the house had gone eerily quiet. The 30 guests had long since fled, terrified of being caught in the blast radius of a family implosion. I met the lead guard at the front steps. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man named Marcus. I handed him the legal documents Nathaniel had prepared, proving my absolute ownership of the property. Nobody leaves this estate with anything other than their personal clothing and basic toiletries, I instructed Marcus, my voice steady. No artwork, no silver, no electronics that belong to the house, and absolutely no financial documents. If anyone tries to take a vehicle registered to the family trust, you stop them. Marcus nodded, his face unreadable. He dispatched his 2 men to the rear exits and the garage. I finally walked back into the house. The grand foyer, usually spotless, was littered with empty wine glasses and discarded napkins. It looked like the aftermath of a riot. I headed straight for my father's old study. Nathaniel was already there, a pot of black coffee brewing on a small side table. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. The mahogany desk was buried under stacks of file folders, bank statements, and leather-bound ledgers. The security team is outside, I told him, taking a seat opposite the desk. Good, Nathaniel replied, handing me a mug of black coffee. Because we have a lot of work to do, and I don't want any interruptions. Julian is desperate. Desperate men do stupid things. As if on cue, Marcus's voice crackled over the radio sitting on the edge of the desk. Ms. Vance. We have a situation at the side entrance near the kitchen. Nathaniel and I exchanged a look. We walked down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the kitchen. When we pushed the swinging doors open, the scene was almost too pathetic to comprehend. Julian was standing near the pantry, wearing a cashmere overcoat over his wrinkled dress shirt. In his arms, he was awkwardly clutching a massive wooden chest. It was the family's antique sterling silver flatware set, a collection worth over $40,000. One of the security guards was standing casually between Julian and the door, his arms crossed. Julian's face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide and panicked. "This is mine," he stammered, holding the chest tighter. "Sienna's grandmother gave this to her. It belongs to us." "Put it down, Julian," I said, stepping into the light. He jumped, almost dropping the heavy box. He looked at me, his chest heaving. The arrogant, slick businessman who had tried to steal $15 million from me a few hours ago was completely gone. In his place was a terrified little boy caught stealing candy. "Willow, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking. "I just need something to pawn." "You froze the accounts." "My credit cards are declining. The firm is going to lock me out tomorrow morning. I don't have enough cash to even buy a plane ticket." "That sounds like a structural flaw in your business model," I said coldly. "Put the silver on the counter." Julian hesitated. He looked at the guard, then at me. Slowly, defeated, he placed the heavy wooden chest on the marble island. He didn't say another word. He just lowered his head and walked away, disappearing into the dark corridors of the house. I watched him go, feeling absolutely nothing. We spent the rest of the night in the study, surrounded by the ghosts of my family's financial sins. The deeper we dug into the boxes of records, the more sickening the picture became. This wasn't just a case of poor money management or lavish spending. This was a systematic, calculated looting of an empire. Nathaniel walked me through the ledgers line by line. The trust my grandfather had built to sustain the vineyard for generations had been treated like an endless ATM. There were withdrawals for $200,000 labeled as vineyard maintenance that matched the exact dates Sienna bought her matching customized Range Rovers. There were invoices for agricultural consulting that turned out to be payments to Julian's offshore gambling debts in Macau. But the vanity purchases were just the surface rot. Around 3 a.m, Nathaniel pulled out a thick manila envelope from the bottom of a locked drawer he had forced open. He spread the documents across the desk. "This," Nathaniel said, tapping a pen against a loan agreement, "is where civil liability turns into a federal crime." I leaned in, rubbing my tired eyes. It was a commercial loan application from a predatory lending firm in Chicago. The principal amount was $500,000, carrying a crippling 18% interest rate. It was secured against the heavy farming machinery we used for the grape harvest. "Julian took out a high-risk loan against the tractors?" I asked, confused. "Why?" "The trust had liquid cash 2 years ago." "Look at the guarantor signature line," Nathaniel instructed. I traced my finger down the page. There, in blue ink, was a signature. It read, "Willow Vance." My blood ran cold. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I stared at the looping letters. It looked like my handwriting, but it was slightly off, the angles too sharp, the pressure too even. "I never signed this," I whispered, my voice barely working. "I haven't lived in this country for a decade. I was in London on the date this was supposedly signed." "I know," Nathaniel said softly. "I checked your passport records. You weren't here. Julian forged your signature to secure $500,000 of toxic debt, and Beatrice notarized it. She used her old notary stamp from when she worked in real estate 30 years ago." I sat back in the leather chair, the leather squeaking in the quiet room. The magnitude of their betrayal crashed over me like a physical wave. They hadn't just stolen money. They had framed me. If Julian had defaulted on this loan, and based on his current financial collapse, he absolutely would have, the creditors wouldn't have gone after him. They would have come after me. I would have been dragged into international court, facing fraud charges, ruined credit, and potentially years in a federal prison. My own mother had notarized the document that could have ended my life. "She knew," I said, staring blankly at the wall. "Beatrice knew exactly what this was." "Yes," Nathaniel confirmed. "She sacrificed you to buy Julian another 6 months of pretending he was a Wall Street genius." And the saddest part is, he lost the entire $500,000 in a bad options trade within 3 weeks. I closed my eyes. I thought about the slap at the dinner table. She had called me selfish. She had told me I owed them. All while knowing she had forged my name on a financial death warrant. What do we do with this? I asked, opening my eyes. The exhaustion was gone. All that was left was a hyper-focused, freezing clarity. We add it to the pile, Nathaniel said, carefully sliding the forged document into a protective plastic sleeve. Tomorrow morning, I am sending a courier to the district attorney's office with a complete forensic accounting report. We are filing criminal charges for forgery, wire fraud, and elder financial abuse regarding how they treated your grandfather's accounts in his final months. I nodded slowly. Make sure the DA knows we will not accept any plea deals that avoid jail time. Nathaniel gave me a grim smile. Understood. The sun came up over Napa Valley like a slow-motion fire, casting a brilliant orange glow over the mist-covered vines. I hadn't slept a single minute, but I felt strangely energized. I walked into the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee, only to find my phone buzzing relentlessly on the counter. I had 34 missed calls and over 50 text messages from various cousins, aunts, and family friends. I ignored them and opened my social media. Sienna had struck back. In a desperate attempt to control the narrative, she had gone live on her social media accounts an hour ago. The video was already circulating rapidly. She was sitting in her bedroom, wearing a simple white robe, her makeup carefully smudged to look like she had been crying all night. It was a masterclass in manipulation. I didn't want to bring our private family matters to the internet, Sienna whimpered to the camera, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. But my sister, Willow, has lost her mind. She came back from Europe, manipulated our late grandfather's lawyer into altering the estate documents, and now she is violently kicking our elderly mother out of her own home. She brought armed guards to terrorize us. She's stealing our family legacy. Please, if anyone knows a good litigator, reach out to us. We are victims of a hostile takeover by my own flesh and blood. I watched the video twice. The comments were a flood of outrage directed at me. People calling me a monster, a greedy brat, an abuser. Sienna was trying to use public shame to force me into a negotiation. She thought I cared about the opinions of people I hadn't spoken to in 10 years. I walked back into the study and dropped the phone on Nathaniel's desk. He watched the video without blinking. She's trying to poison the well, Nathaniel noted, adjusting his glasses. She wants the local community to pressure you. Let her, I said, taking a sip of coffee. But let's make sure the people who actually matter see the truth. You mean the country club? Nathaniel asked, already pulling up a blank document on his laptop. The country club, the Vineyard Association, the local banking board, and every high society charity Beatrice is a part of, I confirmed. I don't want to argue on the internet. I want to destroy their social currency in the real world. Within an hour, Nathaniel had drafted a flawless, devastatingly polite cease and desist letter. But the brilliant part wasn't the letter itself, it was the attachments. We included a redacted copy of the true will, confirming my absolute ownership. We included a summary of the forensic audit, detailing the millions of dollars Julian had squandered. And, the killing blow, we included a copy of the forged loan document with Beatrice's fake notary stamp. We didn't post it on social media. That was too cheap. Instead, Nathaniel had his paralegal hand-deliver printed, sealed copies of the dossier to the board of directors of the Napa Valley Country Club, the president of the local sommelier society, and the head of the country day school where Sienna had been trying to get her future imaginary children enrolled. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. By noon, Sienna's phone started ringing, but it wasn't people offering support. It was her wealthy friends quietly distancing themselves. High society in Napa is built on an unspoken rule: you can be cruel, you can be arrogant, but you absolutely cannot be broke, and you definitely cannot be facing federal fraud charges. I sat on the terrace and listened as the reality crashed down on them. Sienna was screaming at someone on the phone in the driveway. What do you mean my membership is suspended pending a review? I've been on the charity gala committee for 5 years. Hello? Hello? She threw her phone against the side of her imported SUV, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of glass. The smear campaign had failed. The fake narrative was dead. There were no more shadows to hide in. The light had exposed everything, and the Vance royalty was officially bankrupt in every possible sense of the word. The 24-hour deadline expired at exactly 8 o'clock that evening, but I gave them until the following afternoon to finish packing. I wasn't doing it out of kindness, I just wanted to make sure Marcus and his security team had enough time to thoroughly search every single box they loaded into their vehicles. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the convoy of defeat was finally ready to roll out. There were 3 luxury SUVs idling in the circular driveway. The irony was palpable, all 3 vehicles were leased through the family trust, which meant that by next week, when Nathaniel canceled the direct debits, the repo men would be hunting them down. But for today, they still had their leather seats. I stood on the massive stone porch, leaning against a pillar, watching them. The sky was an impossible, clear blue. It felt like the house itself was taking a deep breath, filling its lungs with fresh air for the first time in a decade. Julian was the first to leave. He didn't look at me. He kept his head down, his shoulders slumped beneath his wrinkled blazer, and climbed into his car. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. He knew the district attorney's office was already reviewing the forged documents. His future wasn't just broke, it was incarcerated. Sienna slammed the trunk of her car. She was wearing massive dark sunglasses, hiding the swollen, red skin around her eyes. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at me. "You're going to die alone in this giant house, Willow," she spat, her voice thick with venom. "Nobody is ever going to love you. You destroyed your own family for money." "I didn't destroy anything, Sienna," I replied, my voice completely flat. "I just stopped paying for the illusion. Drive safely." She flipped me off, got into her car, and sped down the gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of white dust. That left only Beatrice. She was standing near the open door of the last SUV. She looked small. Without her emerald silk gowns, without her 30 sycophantic guests, without the endless flow of my grandfather's money, she was just an aging, terrified woman. She walked slowly up the steps toward me. Marcus stepped forward to intercept her, but I held up a hand. I let her approach. She stopped 2 feet away from me. Her eyes were bloodshot, the heavy makeup she usually wore completely absent, revealing deep lines of stress and bitterness. "Willow," she whispered. It was the softest I had ever heard her speak. "Please. I have nowhere to go. My friends won't answer my calls. The club won't let me pass the gate. I have $500 in my checking account. I'm your mother. You can't put me on the street." I looked at her face. I looked at the exact spot on her hand that had connected with my cheek 20 hours ago. The phantom sting was still there. "You put yourself on the street, Beatrice," I said quietly. "I was desperate," she cried, a tear finally spilling over her eyelashes. "I made mistakes. Julian pressured me. I didn't want to sign that loan document, but he said we would lose the estate if I didn't. I was trying to protect the house for all of us. For you too. You sold Dad's cameras," I said. It was the only thing that still mattered to me. Not the millions, not the forgery. The cameras. She flinched. "They were just objects, Willow. We needed the cash flow to keep up appearances. If people thought we were broke, the creditors would have panicked." Appearances, I repeated the word, tasting the absolute toxicity of it. "You sacrificed my financial future, you committed a federal crime, and you sold the last remaining pieces of my father's soul, all to keep up appearances." She reached out and tried to grab my hand. I stepped back, letting her fingers grasp empty air. "Forgive me," she begged, her voice breaking into a sob. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything. I'll live in the guest cottage. I won't bother you. Just don't make me leave the gates. I looked at her, searching myself for even a drop of sympathy. I waited to feel the guilt that society tells you you're supposed to feel when your mother cries. But there was nothing. Just a vast, quiet emptiness. The structural rot was finally cut out. When you slapped me at that dinner table in front of 30 people, I said, my voice as hard and unyielding as the stone pillars of the house, you didn't slap a disobedient daughter. You slapped your landlord. Her breath hitched in her throat. The inventory of mercy is completely out of stock, Beatrice. Get off my property before I have Marcus physically remove you for trespassing. She stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. She realized there was no manipulation left to play, no guilt trip left to exploit. She turned around, her shoulders shaking, and walked down the steps. She got into the SUV, shut the door, and drove away. I watched the heavy iron gates close behind her, the magnetic lock clicking shut with a heavy, satisfying thud. They were gone. The silence that fell over the estate after the gates closed was profoundly different from the silence I had walked into yesterday. Yesterday, the silence was a trap waiting to be sprung. Today, it was the sound of true, uninterrupted peace. I paid the security team for a full month in advance and told them to set up a permanent rotation at the gates. Then, I walked back into the study. Nathaniel was packing his briefcase. He looked exhausted, but there was a deep sense of relief in his eyes. He snapped the latches shut and picked up a heavy canvas bag that had been sitting near the sofa. He placed it carefully on the desk. I made a few phone calls this morning, Nathaniel said softly. To some local pawn shops and private collectors in the Bay Area. Julian wasn't very smart about covering his tracks when he liquidated the smaller assets. I felt my heart skip a beat. I stepped forward and unzipped the canvas bag. Inside, wrapped in protective bubble wrap, were 6 vintage Leica lenses and the heavy, silver body of my father's 1954 camera. They hadn't found all of them, but they had found the one that mattered the most. I picked up the cold metal body. It fit perfectly in the palm of my hand. The smell of the old leather casing brought an instant rush of tears to my eyes. It was the first time I had cried since I got the email in London. I pressed the camera to my chest, closing my eyes, feeling a profound sense of return. Thank you, Nathaniel, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. For everything. Your father would be very proud of you, Willow, he said, giving me a gentle nod. You saved the foundation. Now, it's up to you to decide what to build on it. He let himself out, leaving me alone in the house. I didn't sleep in the main bedrooms. I slept on the leather sofa in the study, surrounded by the boxes of financial records and the comforting weight of the camera. I slept deeply, without dreams, for the first time in years. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. The house was cold and still. I grabbed my father's camera, loaded a fresh roll of black and white film into the back, and walked out the front doors. The air was freezing, biting at my cheeks. I walked past the empty driveway, past the silent guest cottages, and out into the heart of the vineyard. The earth was soft under my boots. I climbed to the top of the highest hill on the property, a spot my father used to bring me to when I was a little girl. I sat on a rock and waited. Slowly, the horizon began to bleed from bruised purple to a brilliant, blinding gold. The sun crested over the Napa Mountains, sending rays of light cutting through the heavy morning fog. The light hit the dew on the grape leaves, turning the entire valley into a sea of glittering diamonds. I raised the heavy vintage camera to my eye. I adjusted the focus ring, feeling the mechanical click of the gears. I framed the shot, the sprawling, endless rows of vines, the historic stone house in the distance, and the clear, open sky above it all. There were no shadows left. Only the truth. I held my breath, stabilized my hands, and pressed the shutter. The story ends here. I chose to kick my own mother and sister out of the house that very night, leaving them with not a penny after what they did. Some say they're still blood relatives, but I believe betrayal is even worse than blood. Was I too cold and cruel, or was I simply saving myself? What would you do if you were in my situation? Leave your verdict in the comments. And don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next dramatic stories. Thank you for watching.